All right. Welcome, everybody. How are you doing today, James?
I'm doing great, Andrew. It's like, I'm actually feeling really relaxed right now with this smooth jazz going in the background. I feel like
Nice.
this is going to be the, easy conversation about data governance. But no, it's like all jokes aside, this is going to be actually a really good, meaty conversation around, you know, um, change management techniques that can help to improve your opportunity for success around, around data governance, but it could actually be around just about any, big data program. So really looking forward to chatting about this.
Nice. And I think the part that I love about the smooth jazz piece, right, is this conversation should just be like so easy whenever you're talking about it with data governance. But I think the part that people miss is there really is a recipe to it, just like jazz, right? You've got a couple key components there, even if you're doing some free form jazz. Um, if
Yeah.
if you've got the key ingredients in there, like a little bit of saxophone, right? You've got some different instruments in there. You can make it as smooth as you want it, uh, and it doesn't have to be like hard rock or punk or anything crazy in terms of like getting everybody to fall into line in regards to some of your strategies for governance.
And you're so right. So yeah, you are the king of analogies, by the way. Um, we could probably just have a whole series on, data analogies by Andrew Kim. I, you know, that is like literally spot on. I mean, it's like, talking about, symbiosis, but like, when you're talking about that of people, obviously there's a lot of orchestration that has to happen around big programs like data governance. And, you have each person who has their own set of skills, sort of their own area of expertise that they're always going to really focus on, which can tend to sometimes put blinders around other areas or other skills that are required.
Yeah.
And you know you think about a jazz band, especially jazz bands, right? So you get situations where you've got like the saxophonist who's like, obviously he's really great at following, music, but at the same time, then he's required to jump in and ad lib, get to go through his solo and ad lib, but he's still got to be aware of everything else around him, right? The drums are, just gonna make sure he's like hitting the right rhythm, and that he's still, obviously hitting on the right key, and just basically ensuring that sort of everything around him in that environment is both aligned and kind of sort of like basically working with him and he's working with them in a sense. And and I can totally see that in really in data governance. The big part of that, and this is what we're here to talk about, is the people side of data governance. Organizing and making sure that everybody has a say, and that you've got these key stakeholders who really have some specific needs and some specific requirements, specifically around data and how it can be enabled to work for them. And it's one of those things where you can't have a sales stakeholder coming in to say, well, I need all these things, forget about everybody else. If you can just take care of these things for me, we should be good to go. But data governance is really more holistic and it's more enterprise wide. It's something that if you only think about it in one silo, one vertical, it's really not going to work so well for you.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think when we kind of talk about different venues within data governance as a whole, right, there's lots of questions around obviously why it fails. And when we're here at the start of the year, everybody's all rested and they're excited, right? I mean, what's one of the first things that you really see in terms of people walking in excited and then it just not working out?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I'm going to answer that in 1 second. I just realized that I do need to just let everyone know that we have Gaurav Gupta, who's going to be joining on the second half of this session, and he will be talking specifically about the change management techniques. He comes from Kotter, and Kotter is renowned and one of those foremost authorities around change management. And Gaurav has a lot to say about data in general, and some of the so-called insurmountable issues, or seemingly insurmountable issues that people face, and how they can apply some more modern change management techniques to make it work for you to successfully implement a program that's going to address those issues or challenges. So just wanted to get that out there. Sorry, I just realized that we hadn't mentioned that right at the beginning.
And the book really looks incredible. I haven't had a chance to pick it up yet, but after reading the abstract, etc., I'm really excited to have him on today to be discussing data governance and really what's going to make it succeed for a company, right? And the title, I think, for his book is perfect in terms of how organizations achieve hard to imagine results, right?
Yep.
I think when we talk about hard to imagine results, there's already questions around like, hey, where do we get started, right? So are there any softwares that we would recommend for data governance from Hector?
Right.
Great question, Hector.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of those things that I really look forward to getting into in a few minutes here. And I think it's just I guess just to kind of go back to your initial question, in terms of some of the common reasons why a data governance program would fail. It's like one of the big ones that I hear regularly is just that it's not worth it.
Yeah.
And by that I mean you get the leadership, you get the C-suite, or actually even senior management. So we're sort of talking about the top level of the organization, who are perhaps not nearly as close to the details, to the areas that are not necessarily working in the organization, whether it be a data quality topic or something even around your master data management. Perhaps your bills are not being paid in time because you're not looking after your customer master data.
Yeah. I think people lose sight of that, right? Like we talk about governance, like maybe it's additional overhead. And when I look at data governance as a whole, there could literally be money that you're leaving on the table. Like I used to work in, a long time ago, I actually had a landscaping business. So I was in landscaping and I did pool care. And whenever you kind of talk about those bills, right, a perfect example would be when you have good data governance, you can examine, hey, what does that turnover look like in terms of accounts, right? And can you do things like factoring, which is essentially, hey, I'm not able to collect on this, or I don't think I'm going to be able to, right? Is that something that we should actually sell essentially to a debt collection agency, right? And then maybe we get pennies on the dollar, but now we're not wasting our time. We can refocus our efforts and our business on this. And then we can give that to someone else. So at least we're able to focus on our core, and then we can continue to drive dollars where we need to.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I guess the point of that is, among many other good points around that, but one of the main points around that is that you, even as a small business, are thinking through the concept of ROI, right? Return on investment.
Yeah.
And your return on investment is going to be one around, the potential cost savings associated with doing something, or the additional revenue that can be received and realized as a result of doing something. But then it can also be, and as I think in your case, it's like an opportunity cost thing, right? So
Yes.
if you want or need to focus on your core business, what are those things that can be done to either automate, outsource, or gain efficiencies in order to enable you to focus on those core strategies? And this again sort of really ties back, obviously, to data in general, and the idea that data can help, as a real true asset, can help any company with with automation and with building in efficiencies where you might have today some heavy manual processes associated with either facilitating a specific operational process, or even just manual work associated with identifying data quality concerns, or even figuring out where there might be issues and having to sort of go dig in and troubleshoot. All of these things can potentially be addressed by data.
Yeah.
And what we tend to get caught up in, I think, the forest for the trees kind of problem, is that you have individuals maybe sort of at the sort of entry to mid-level management who are so in the weeds with these types of problems, working tactically to get them solved, that there isn't enough articulation of the problem further up the chain to help the people at the top who can essentially think things through, or not think things through, it's like work with those teams to collectively think these things through in terms of strategically addressing those changes, strategically addressing those issues and those challenges. And how can they do that? Through better data governance, better data management, master data management, data quality, standards, consistency, breaking down data silos, more collaboration and more enablement. But sort of back to my original point around that the concept of it not being worth it, it's actually a reason why data governance programs rarely even get off the ground in the first place. For a large part, there is this difficulty with people who have expertise around data governance and who are really focused on maybe some point solutions or core projects, who are unable to articulate the problem in such a way that it resonates, from a strategic standpoint and with real clear ROI for the enterprise as a whole. And so as a result, that means that there is very little to no buy-in.
Yeah.
And that's the next sort of big reason why data governance programs fail, is that you get, again, maybe a little bit further down the chain, a situation where you have a focus around a specific mini project, whether that's adding in a data catalog, whether that's thinking about a business glossary, perhaps thinking through improvements around your master data management. And, that focus is, again, around, one specific, component of the larger framework, or it could be something that's getting addressed in a very siloed manner in one part of the business. And, with that comes the problems of, you get that solved for that one vertical, but again, if your business needs to work in a very cohesive way to be more data driven, and to ensure that you're getting everybody across the organization behind working with data, collaborating with data, then data governance or addressing data governance in just one part of the organization doesn't work. The problem is that you might have one or two individuals in certain verticals who are speaking up and who are loud enough and repetitive enough and influential enough to get some sponsorship or some buy-in from that that specific area or vertical.
Yeah.
So it doesn't come together cohesively across the organization. I think starting from the top, starting with the C-suite, starting at sort of the broader level, looking at the organization's strategic imperatives and thinking through business value, and talking about the importance of data governance to enable and assure that business value is realized. That needs to happen first in order to get that full buy-in at the top.
Yeah, and I think when we start talking about this, right, there's a lot of what's and whys that really need to be answered here, right? So like, why is it so important for the organization, right? You have to take that question personally, almost like a Simon Sinek approach, right? And then really getting into like, what is the opportunity here? Because obviously being part of a business, we have to understand what value it's driving for the organization. And I think if we don't start with some of those questions, we're never going to get the buy-in, right? Especially from top leadership, because that's really what's going to be important in terms of ensuring lasting success, as opposed to maybe compartmentalized, like even to a department or a specific team around governance, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely spot on. And I think that this is where Gaurav can, perhaps provide us some insights around that, with some of the case studies that he states in his book. But, the key is there really has to be a cohesive and a resonating message. Usually comes in the form of a mission statement or some kind of set of objectives that ultimately you want the vast majority of your employees to be able to get behind and kind of feel like, hey, this is a mission that I am willing and ready to support and help to move forward.
Yeah.
If you can't have that, if you don't get that message, one, if you don't get the message right, and then two, if you don't get that message, that mission, properly communicated, waterfall throughout the organization, there are sure signs that there's this sort of disconnect around communication and disconnect around strategy.
So when we talk about the mission, right? Should it be, I think, more like inspirationally focused, or should it be, and every time I think of data governance, right, I almost think of like, oh, is it an insurance agency? Should the purchase be led by fear, right? Is there a way or an approach that you kind of see when we talk about like the JAS approach, right? What's the JAS approach to establishing that mission statement?
That's a good question for Gaurav. That is a really good question. I'm trying to think now off the top of my head, like what the mission statement is. Like for Amazon, for example, it's something about being the best company to serve their customers, or it's like something about the happiest customers. Very Amazon/Zappos, right?
Yeah.
And again, I'm not an employee of Amazon. Obviously, I'm like a heavy patron of Amazon. and I know and I understand their mission, and I can see that that mission lands quite well, and is clearly bought in by the rest of the company,
Yeah.
because that's essentially what they've been able to successfully do to get customers to come back time and time again.
I think when we're talking about that, right, because I just pulled up Google's mission statement because I was kind of curious about that, right? Theirs is interesting because literally it's to organize and make information universally accessible, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
useful and accessible. I think when we look at data governance, it's that same approach, right? Because if it accessible, if it's not accessible, right, which is typically what we see today, is there's a lot of silos that exist, and silos not necessarily just because of security, right? It could literally just be from the accessibility standpoint. That's part of what's limiting for us making holistic decisions. And today, the people who experience that the most are typically going to be the C-suite, right? Because they're trying to get at, hey, how do I make the strategic vision, or why isn't the strategic decisions that I'm trying to make coming to fruition the way that I want them to happen? And when we talk about that, right, it ends up feeling like this. And then we kind of end up in that position where there's not really any ownership, right? So you can't really say there's one particular person, hey, that's supposed to be an IT thing, right? Or that's a business thing. And we don't really get to the point where we really feel like we have true stakeholders in now our most important asset, which is data.
Yeah, 100%. There's this analogy that an old, not old, ex, I shouldn't say old, that would, ex-boss of mine used to say, which is, it's really hard to change the tires on a moving car. And that's ultimately what has to happen, around these concepts of, delivering a mission statement. And generally, I guess for a very embedded company who's been around for many years or decades, you're going to be tasked with changing the tires on a moving car. You're going to have to sort of basically reinvent, come up with this new mission statement, perhaps even a new fresh logo, get everybody kind of really sort of bought into the fact that, hey, times have changed. You've got, you're in a new era, right? It's the information era, and you have to get on board really quickly. And so, with your point about no ownership, I think again, sort of the concept of no ownership is largely again because of the lack of buy-in or understanding of the importance of data and how much it can enable the organization as a whole. And the fact that it can't be clearly articulated how a data governance program can help drive forward, that mission, really drive forward those strategic imperatives, gaining the buy-in of, leadership, who then are, working with their teams and working with organizations and essentially influencing or motivating everybody to do their part and identify, very important piece of that is like identify what their role is, where they can be accountable, and why it is that individual might be accountable. But yeah, it's, like ownership doesn't sit in one specific space. I mean, it's like we always hear data governance is a business program. I mean, I agree that it should be run and sponsored by the business, but there 100% needs to be IT accountability and ownership as well.
Yeah, I think people often think of data being very linear, like a string, right? And when I look at it, I would almost say fabric, right? Like a data fabric, but it reminds me more of like a carbon fiber. And you're like, Andrew, where are you going with this, right? It's because carbon fiber is fairly rigid, right? And when we look at it as a whole, like it's some of the lightest uh, materials on Earth, but it's also one of the strongest. But it does have a little bit of that brittle nature, right? So when we look at like a carbon fiber bike, I mean, that's what everybody's using right now, right? The fastest cars in the world, they're using carbon fiber.
Yeah.
And when we look at that, right, the amount of torque and stuff that that car has really help it stand the tests of agility, of that quick braking, etc. Right? And I look at data governance allowing us to do that. So when we talk about COVID, right, if you have strong data governance, hey, I can go from 60 to 0 just as fast as I can go from 0 to 60, right? We need to be able to do that so we can pivot as an organization. And I think something that really struck me when you were talking about data governance, right, which is actually a book. This is like a permanent edition on my desk right now, because I just finished reading it and we're reading it here as a company on cultural renovation, and it's 18 rules on how to make an unshakable company, right? And one of the things that it's literally talking about is the difference between just doing a renovation, right? And then doing a complete overhaul. And whenever we talk about those two things, that becomes extremely important, because when we talk about data governance, right, you literally said, hey, we got to change the tires while it's moving. Well, when I'm thinking about that, right, there's like one vehicle that you always see the tires kind of lifted up on. It's that big monster dump truck that's like carrying the whole load, right? And it's got that one set of tires that kind of goes up. And that's kind of what I imagine is you've got like a couple little gremlins or something hanging off the side who are supposed to be changing the tires out, right? Or some minions out there swapping them out for you. And then literally they just kind of keep those moving so we can keep on rolling. And I think when we look at that, that's going to be important for an organization, is recognizing, hey, we're not going to strip our data infrastructure down to the ground, right? It's not bulldoze it and come in and start from scratch. We obviously have operations, etc., that we need to maintain. I think COVID was actually one of the few exceptions to that, right? Where you at least had some time to start from scratch, maybe, and revisit doing an overhaul. But that's literally the first time in our span of life, right, where I can think of a time that you really had that without having some major business impacts. And it looks like we have our guest speaker here joining us as well. So welcome.
Hey, Gaurav.
Hello. Hi. Nice to be here.
Awesome.
You've joined into this very serene, relaxed environment with some jazz music playing in the background there. So, feel free to kick back.
Perfect. Unfortunately, all I've got is some coffee. So
there you go. All right. That's actually the opposite of what we're going for, but that's all right. Gaurav, we've been just chatting a little bit around some of the top reasons why we see data governance programs failing, and I think it's like I touched on this earlier. It's like whether it's a data governance program or whether it's a digital transformation of some kind, or whatever it might be. It's sort of a large implementation. There are some change management concepts and techniques that can be reviewed and agreed by those who are making those attempts and are failing to really understand the people element and just how important it is to sort of keep a focus on the people element if you want to drive these types of programs forward. So we're touching on just some things like it not being a data governance program not being worth it, because there's this lack of articulation around the ROI to really sort of get, your C-suite executives behind it. And then to that next point, it's like there's no buy-in, largely because, again, there's a lack of understanding of how a data governance program can help enable that broader mission or vision that your leadership have for your organization as a whole. What else did we talk about, Andrew? Talked about
just kind of the ownership. I mean, we infused a couple of different analogies, Gaurav, and I think what I'd love to hear from you is we've kind of talked about some different pain points, right? And what I would love to hear, and I know you address this in your book, is what are some ways to kind of alleviate those, right? So getting buy-in or getting ownership, what are some of the success factors that you really feel hold the keys to that?
Yeah. No, it's so I should first say, by the way, my knowledge of data governance as a field is very limited, but I will start by saying this, right? So in the research that we were doing for the book, one of the things we were focused on is trying to understand what are situations where people embrace change, and then what are situations where people resist it. Because while we always talk about human nature is we resist change, we don't like change, it's not entirely true, right? There are certain changes that people love and embrace and run towards. And so we were trying to understand what is the underlying factor that determines whether we embrace change or run from it. And a lot of it comes down to our human biology and whether we are perceiving that as a threat or an opportunity, right? If I perceive a change as a threat, it kicks in my fight or flight response. I'm gonna push back hard because it's a threat-inducing thing. If on the other hand I perceive the change as an opportunity, that's very different. That's now sparking curiosity. That's sparking my love for novelty. I'm gonna want to embrace it. I'm gonna want to go towards it. And so, when people say data governance, it has two words that I think, unfortunately, unless we are careful, spark the threat side, right? Because governance, immediately, it's sort of the red flags are going off. Oh gosh, what am I going to get myself in trouble? Data, interestingly enough, although many of us who deal with data all the time think of it as good. The thing with data is more data isn't always good, because it can certainly trigger that survive because I can't interpret it. I'm not sure what this means. Oh, there's like 7 different metrics I'm tracking, and one of them is flashing red, and that's and I ignore the 6 that are green and wonderful because that's just how we're built, and we go straight to it. So I guess all of that to say, I think the first thing is how do you take the topic, in this case, data governance, and move from it being purely a problem-driven, something to fix, something negative, something threat-inducing, and more towards an opportunity, right? What is this going to enable us to do as an organization? What does better data governance allow us to do that we can't do without it? What are the opportunities that we have in front of us? And so that's the first thing I'd say, is that the more we can sort of switch that messaging to be about opportunities and what we can do that we couldn't do before, the more it's going to activate that thrive mindset, the more it's going to activate that sort of opportunity seeking, curiosity. I want to run towards it. I don't want to resist it. So that would be the first thing. The other thing from what we've seen with, and now I'll speak more broadly about digital transformations, is they tend to often not connect to business objectives, right? We're doing a digital transformation because, I don't know, we either our competitors are doing something and they're going online, and so we need to go online, right? So
it's sort of a fight response, right?
Yeah, it's a follow what somebody else is doing, or it's hey, we need to put in new systems because the old systems don't really work, so we're doing a system implementation of some sort, but we haven't really taken the time to say, how does this connect to our business objectives and our business priorities, right? And if you don't do that, then obviously it's hard to get people's attention, because we've all got 100 things that we're trying to deal with on a daily basis, and if I don't see how this particular thing connects to my priorities, I'm not going to pay attention to it. So that's the other thing, is connecting to business priorities and objectives, and not seeing it as a standalone implementation. And then tied to that, and I think a lot of us have faced this, is anything to do with data or digital ends up becoming an IT project, right? It ends up becoming a siloed, IT is going to drive this, and then it is driven by a very few people. Solutions are developed in a conference room or in the IT department, and it doesn't engage everybody else, right? It doesn't bring the user in. It doesn't bring that the folks are going to have to then change their behaviors and their mindsets into the conversation. And so that would be the other piece, is being more expansive and bringing people in early, even in the development of the solution, and in the development of the use case and the value case and the business case for it. So just bringing more people into the conversation early always helps with buy-in as well, because there's this well documented effect, right? Of if you're involved with something, you value it more.
Yes.
It's the I talk about it as the IKEA effect, right? You build some IKEA furniture, and the fact that you've invested your labor in building it means you value it more than if you'd bought it built.
It doesn't matter if there's a couple screws missing or whatever. It's yours now, right?
No, in fact, it's better if there's a couple of screws missing, because look at look at your ingenuity in being able to still build it without the two screws, right? So
exactly.
So there is the sense of, if I'm involved with something, I value it more than if I wasn't involved with developing it. And so getting people involved early definitely helps. And then the final thing I'd maybe say is just, and this was my point earlier about, more data isn't always good, because there is so much noise right now, right? There's so much noise in the business world. There is, you get 100 reports and 5 memos and 1,000 metrics to look at. And so anytime we're launching any kind of an implementation project, initiative, change, being able to reduce the amount of noise around it and sort of distilling it down to the 2 or 3 things that really matter, and not the 100 things, that sort of are on the fringes of it. Again, helps to reduce that threat-inducing survive channel, right? Because that noise always sort of triggers that threat. So that's sort of a few things that I think help. I don't know if any of that resonates with either of you.
It all does. But it's interesting. I like the idea that you can kind of get some focus if you can reduce that noise. And we were just talking earlier, Gaurav, about like the analogy of changing tires on a moving car. You've got these companies, especially those that are embedded and it's like big incumbents who have a ton going on, obviously, all the time.
Yeah.
And then I don't know. I think I've heard it somewhere that if you can kind of get your project in as like one of the top 3 on the minds of the C-suite or the guy at the top, then it's got a better chance of landing. Like, how do you have any sort of ideas or sort of techniques around what is it that you could do to convince those at the top that they need to focus on 1, 2, maybe at most 3 things that that will move the dial, and how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, maybe 2 comments on that, right? One is absolutely agree. It's sort of the fact that this is something that is important to the folks at the top of the organization is critical. Also, what is often overlooked is, how do you convince everybody else, and early on, right? There's this sense that, look, if I get the CEO to be convinced, then he or she is going to be able to, push it through the organization. And at least what we found in all of our research is that doesn't really happen, right? Most often, change gets, and by the way, the research on how often at least large scale transformations are successful is abysmal. Most often they're not, and that's, I think, largely because we rely on a few people to try to drive the bus, and assume everybody else will get on board, which doesn't happen. So that's one piece of it. Is we've got to look at it both ways, right? We've got to get the top of the house to be bought in, but we've also got to figure out how do we get everybody else bought in early, not after everything's been decided, right? Not we've already decided.
There's no buy-in from them.
Yeah. So back to your original question of, so how do you raise or elevate the importance of it? I mean, I think it goes back to the point around, what does this do for the business, right? What are the what are the objectives the business is trying to achieve over the next 2 years, 3 years, and how does this fit in with achieving those objectives? And frankly, if it doesn't, it's not going to get on the agenda, right? If it's now, it might be that there's an indirect link, right? It's a look, there's a high level of risk that we're tolerating without doing something. So there's a, it's a downside risk mitigation sort of a rationale for it. And so it's not a direct link to the business objectives, but it could be a huge obstacle to achieving what we're trying to achieve. And if we don't take care of this, then we're gonna, it poses the risk of derailing our priority or our strategy. So, but being able to connect it back to the objectives is I think the only way to really get focus on it. And then not being expansive about the 100 things, but only the 2 or 3 things that really matter, and then the rest of it, you may feel passionately about it, but there's no point in trying to get others to feel passionately about it, because they'll only care about the most important to benefit.
Yeah, and I think, look, I think it's safe to say that around this topic, around data in general, that does kind of sit right up there. I imagine among most companies as an imperative that is appealing to their fight emotion, like their fight senses, which is to say, hey, if we don't better leverage our data assets, if we don't find some way of driving insights and value from this data that we're collecting, then we're just going to become a dinosaur. We're just going to be extinct.
And that's an interesting point. And actually, I talked about sort of the threat and the opportunity. I want to be careful, because while the research does show that the opportunity focus is what drives long-term change, if you want to get people to pay attention to something, the threat works just as well. So being able to articulate what the threat is in the situation certainly gets people to focus attention on it. Now, what we found is if that's all it is, if it's all threat focused, then eventually people lose energy, because that fight or flight response actually is draining. It drains over time, and so you can't maintain that for too long. So at some point it's got to also be about not just, hey, we'll be dinosaurs, but about look at how we can outcompete our competitors, and look at what we'll be able to do if we can actually draw real insights from our data and use it effectively. Look at how much more we'll be able to achieve. So the messaging does need to shift. But you're absolutely right that starting from here's the real danger in the situation can actually, and in fact can create focus faster.
So switching like from adrenaline to stamina, right? Like, hey, we have to keep this objective running. I mean, it may have been that first project, like the MVP or something, the competitor who's doing something innovative, right, that triggers that response to, hey, let's try this out to see if we can do something similar or better, right? And then, okay, now that we've realized that we can do this, right, now we need to start training ourselves to maintain this extra weight that we feel like we're carrying every day. We're going to do that because there's opportunities in it, right? And
and I love that you used adrenaline, because this is all built. I mean, without sort of getting too far into it, but this is all based on science, right? It's based on biology, and you're actually right. It's adrenaline. The threat induces adrenaline. It induces that's what gets the focus, because what adrenaline does is it actually focuses us, right? The problem is it focuses us at the expense of curiosity and innovation. And that's why the Survive channel, which I mentioned earlier, is an adrenaline-driven sort of thing, whereas the Thrive channel, that's a different set of chemicals, and it's chemicals that are much more likely to inspire innovation and creativity. So this is hardwired in us. It is biology. It isn't just abstract concepts.
Nice. Yeah, I'm excited to kind of see. I mean, especially post-COVID, right? I feel like a lot of us are coming off of these adrenaline highs within our organizations, right? It was fight or flight response, and now we have to get back to the core of our business, right? And I think a lot of us have questions around the why, right? Or some of the things that we are doing, whether they're new activities that arose because of COVID, or they're things that we've just historically been doing. Like perfect example would be going into the office, right? Is it worth it? From a digital transformation perspective, I mean, now there's no excuse about the infrastructure, right? All those hurdles are gone. So it's, hey, is this something that brings value to the company or fulfillment for taking care of our entire organization?
Yeah, and you're lucky if those kinds of scenarios spark that level of inquisitiveness or curiosity, or you have individuals with influence within your organization who are thinking about those things. I do think, sort of back to I think an earlier point from Gaurav's, that people are just so heavily focused on the need of the hour, right? So like an implementation or a migration, something sort of very maybe technical. There was an acquisition. Now we have to assimilate the other company. That again, it just comes back to, okay, stop. Let's take a minute and figure out, is everything that we're doing, moving the whole mission forward, the strategy forward for the company. And the reason that I think that that's so important around this topic around data governance is that data governance as a program has the capability to really truly drive and enable company missions and big company strategies at the enterprise, at the organizational level. And so that's where I think again there's this misnomer around data governance, or just around data in general, where people feel like data is owned by and only can be really managed by IT. And that's very problematic, obviously. As you think about assets or company assets, and so like about data, the fact that we're in the information age, if data is not being treated by organizations as an asset in the same way that real dollars are, with finance teams, you have your CEOs, CFOs who are looking at revenue on a daily, if not hourly basis. Hey, how about those other assets? What are you doing there? What are you like? How in tune are you to your data assets, and how are you using them to really scale your company and be competitive? And so that's so I think problem number one is just getting past that stigma and those old ways of thinking. And again, sort of another point that you brought up, Gaurav, is around data governance. The term governance, that word, implying policy, policing, potentially sort of discipline and penalties if you're not compliant. All of those things, it's like are eliciting those types of emotions and getting people concerned about. You're just like, look, it's flight. I'm going to just avoid that altogether. It doesn't sound like something I can get behind. I don't understand it, so I'm just not going to touch it.
So, Gaurav, I have a question for you as we're kind of talking about this, right? From a biology perspective, a lot of this almost relates to habits, right? The frequency at which we're experiencing some of these things, including change. Like I'm sitting here staring at my phone, right? They've trained us, hey, every year or two, a new phone's going to come out and you're going to buy it because you're going to love it, right? So when we talk about this from a digital transformation perspective, how often do you feel like we need to be at least reflecting back or reflecting on the future in regards to change, digital change that we should be incorporating in our organization?
Yeah, I think it brings up a point which I think is critical in any discussion about change these days, which is we've always treated change as something somewhat episodic, right? When we think about a digital transformation. It's I do it once, and then hey, for the next 5 years, I'm good, and then 5 years later, I got to go through a transformation again, right? And
Exactly.
same thing with whenever in the business context we think about change, we think about these large scale episodic events, right? Restructuring business, a merger or an acquisition, or and of course those are the large scale disruptive changes. I mean that's where a business really significantly deviates from what it's currently doing, and it's a big. What's different though is those things are happening much faster, right? They're happening.
Yes.
They're having to happen much faster because to keep up with the external context of change, and COVID is the perfect example. I mean, the speed with which businesses had to change during COVID is faster than anything we've experienced in the recent past. I don't think it's entirely anomalous, by the way, and there's data that backs this up, right? That shows that while there's this massive spike in uncertainty and sort of the pace at which we were moving during COVID, it's actually been increasing for quite a while now. But it's been increasing, slower compared to what we've experienced, and so it hasn't been as jarring. But I think we're starting to recognize that this isn't going to go away, right? This needs to continuously evolve and continuously change and continuously move with speed and agility and pivot and look for new opportunities isn't going away anytime soon. And so, I think part of this is organizations moving away from the mindset of I implement one thing and then I run the business for 5 years in the same way, and then I go through another big change, and moving towards how do you create an organization that is more adaptable, that is more agile, that is able to pivot faster, and is able to sort of respond to these things, and we're not viewing them as one-off occurrences, but as actually things that happen on a fairly regular basis, because that I think is what's going to be needed to be successful.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about that, right, I mean, it makes me think, hey, your book shouldn't just be a one and done read, right? It should be a reference book that's on the shelf, because as we're going through this, right, we really got to internalize that and make sure that, hey, I just went through a change, right? What's the next one? What's the next goal? I mean, it's no different than being like in the gym or any other place. And I think what you had said about COVID is 100% true. And I think of all the industries that really experienced this, it was really the restaurant industry that took the hardest hit. And that's because when you look at that industry, right, everybody from the chefs, etc., all had a moment to reflect. And they asked themselves that, why am I here? Is this what I'm passionate about, right? Whether it's that specific type of food or the industry as a whole. And we saw mass amounts of movement. And I don't think we took a lot of those individuals for granted, right? And now when I look at that from a digital transformation perspective, I think it's almost like somebody taking the rug outside and just doing this real quick, right? And okay, we did that once and whew, that was a lot of dust, right? But like you had mentioned, this is going to keep happening, right? And it's going to move faster. And I think when we look at this, industries that historically we thought were safe, right? Now with deep tech and the idea of kind of converging all these things together, we're going to see movement in industries that may have not had movement for 50, 100 years, right? Just because we all have IoT sensors now, and we should be monitoring everything from like drinking water, right, at all these different points. That infrastructure is literally, from a utility perspective, is supposed to be degraded over 100 years, right? Now all of a sudden it's like, oh, we got a windmill that's up there. Whew. In like 10 years, the output of that thing should be like 5x what it is now, just to comply with needs. And that's where I look at data. We're going to have to get that much out of data, right? And then out of digital transformations, we're going to be so focused on what is the outcome that I should be looking for here. And I should be excited about that opportunity, because that's what's going to really allow us to capitalize on growth.
And that point around the outcome is so important, because I think in many places, not everywhere, but in many places, our ability to collect data and our ability to capture data has outpaced, I I don't know if it's ability or just that we haven't done it, but has outpaced our ability to interpret it and utilize it effectively, right?
Oh, for sure.
I think that's where we run into challenge, right? You've got all the data, you've got more data than you ever had before, but we still don't really know exactly how to interpret it and use it effectively. And that's what, when I earlier talked about, that can be scary. That can be very scary for people within business.
And that's sort of back to something you mentioned earlier, Gaurav, about the fact that you don't really truly understand data governance yourself, but sort of back to the point of it being scary, the thought of being able to interpret and extract value from that data is all about sort of the data governance principles of being able to just properly organize and manage your data so that you can do that. And that's really what it comes down to with data governance. And so I think just in these final few minutes, I want to sort of tie together some of these concepts of the topics we've been talking about and just see if look at it from the point of view of a case study that you mentioned in your book, Gaurav. It's like this one resonated with me. It was a European utilities company that was looking to implement SAP. So they had this realization that they needed to be really on the bandwagon around being more digital, more digitally inclined, and so they were going through this digital transformation, and this ERP implementation was important for them. And the interesting thing that I noted was that the CEO was the very person, so it was obviously the very top, who drove that change. Being very influential himself, was able to sort of really get his leadership on board. So the key being is that I think buy-in is going to be incredibly important. So being able to articulate the importance of the data governance program so that it ties directly into those mission statements and the strategic imperatives of the company is probably like the single most important thing in order to then get into the next concepts of ownership and ensuring that everybody's getting behind the whole concept of data governance and what it means for their company. And like, if you don't do it, perhaps if we're sort of looking at the threat perspective, if you don't do it, this is what's going to happen. And something in your book, Gaurav, was like, that again resonated, was that the leadership team that was behind this SAP implementation, they realized that they had to get to some very creative ways. They went through these theatrics of making the entire room dark for a small period of time to really appeal to the emotions of all the employees who were all assembled in this one space, to show how important it is to get behind this, because you might have moments of darkness, and apparently that resonated enough that that you got these volunteers, like literally people from different parts of the organization who actually wanted to themselves, they weren't necessarily in the roles that required them to do this, but they wanted to be involved in one of the important first steps of this ERP implementation, which was around cleaning up their data. So Gaurav, I'm sure you probably have final thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know we're almost out of time, so I'll just say one thing, which is that story is a fantastic example of what happens when you're able to tap into the potential of the whole organization, because they were able to get, as you say, people to actually volunteer to do things, because they felt so passionately about it, because they completely understood what this SAP implementation was going to enable them to do. And by the way, they won awards for their SAP implementation because it was one of the best, even from the standpoint of adoption and the actual implementation went extremely smoothly, and they got massive benefits out of it. So it's a great story.
It really is. And it's something that again goes back to how can you achieve anything if you've got people on the top just driving it down and forcing it down your throats without anybody really understanding why. So that's, again, so we'll go back to in future sessions, the whole concept of, the people, the emotional side of data governance and how important that is to sort of really drive that forward. Gaurav, really great to have you on this session. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Great conversation. Thanks, James. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. And
Thank you,
happy Thursday, everyone. The end of the week's almost here, and we've been off to a great start this year. So please, if you're looking to check out more on our videos, hit that like or love button and subscribe. We've got some exciting new ones coming every month, so feel free to check out our next data governance session. And as always, every Thursday, we're here doing Thought Leader Thursdays at Data Meeting. So thank you to our leadership for their support, and to special guests like Gaurav, who's here helping us make the conversations forever interesting. Happy Thursday, everyone.
Take care. Bye all.